I would like to point out the county clerk was killed at the raid of Lawrence. He tried to defend Lawrence, and he was killed. His house still stands on Ohio Street. And the county clerk before that had been killed fighting at the Battle of Pea Ridge. So it's kind of a dangerous position that I'm in at times. And I kind of feel like I'm in a dangerous position now. So thank you to the Weavers for hosting this. We're trying to reach out throughout the county. When I was vice chair of the party, one of the things we talked about, some of you knew Maryland Greathouse, we talked about getting outside the bounds of Lawrence. Douglas County is more than just Lawrence. And so it was really important for us that we do this. I'm glad that the party's still doing this. Thank you to Nora for asking me. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Yesterday was Nora's birthday. When she asked me to do this, I think she didn't have a clue what I was going to do. I did this in Baldwin. Evidently, I didn't bore everybody too much. So if you'll allow me a few minutes, I want to talk about a few things that have kind of been circling through my brain lately. I've had the pleasure of being your county clerk for the past 12 years. And I'm thrilled to be serving you at this time, because Kansas finds itself in the middle of a voter rights battle. And it is kind of a privilege, even though some days I question why I'm doing this. It is kind of a privilege to serve you in this capacity. But I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. A few years ago, I was at a national training, and the professor that was giving it said, "Oh, you're from Kansas. I added a slide about you." And that wasn't a good thing, right? She was going to talk about a lot of stuff, and it was talking about suffrage, and it kind of made me sad, because as Kansans, in our core, suffrage is a huge part of who we are. Who gets to vote was a fundamental question at the beginning of our state. In the Wyandotte Convention in the 1860s, we talked about suffrage for African Americans. We talked about suffrage for women. Most people don't know that the state of Kansas was one of the first states to give women the right to vote in any election. They got to vote in school elections. We gave women the right to vote in the 1880s to vote in city elections. And because of that, the first woman ever elected mayor comes from Argonia, Kansas. Does anybody know her name? Anthony, do you know her name? Susanna Salter is the first woman ever elected mayor in the United States. A couple years after that, the first all-female mayor and city council gets elected in Oskaloosa, Kansas, just north of here. There was a wave of all-female electeds that happened. Baldwin City had, I think, the third in the country, and Lucy Sweet was a huge part of that. Has anybody ever heard of the Women's Bridge in Baldwin? A huge thing that happened when they elected all these women was the first thing they did was public works, because they got tired of not having sidewalks, and they got tired of having mud in the streets. And so in Baldwin, there's the Women's Bridge, which is they got tired of having to cross the creek to get to the railroad station. So when they got into power, the first thing they did was they built a bridge. So when you go to the railroad station, you cross the Women's Bridge. So we have this huge history of suffrage in our state. Unfortunately, we find ourselves kind of in the middle of something else, which is we are in, I believe, one of the most fundamental times in our nation's history in dealing with voting. And it involves around this fundamental question that we're not talking about, but our state is in the middle of. And it's a question I thought we solved 50 years ago, which is voting a right or privilege? When we talk about voter ID, when we talk about proof of citizenship, when you hear about all the things that are going on in this country, underlying that is the question of, is voting a right or a privilege? And depending upon how you see that, depends on how you see how we implement voting. If you see voting as a right, then it is protected to the level of speech. It is protected to the level of the right to bear arms. A few years ago in Kansas, we declared ourselves a constitutional carry state. We said that there can't be any rules that cause you not to be able to carry an arm somewhere because it is against the Second Amendment, right? So if we believe in voting to that level, that means that no law should be in place to impact the ability to vote. It is a right. But if you see voting as a privilege, then someone grants that privilege. Someone bestows that privilege. And then it is up to who gets that right, who gets the ability to tell you if you get to vote or not. And that is at the heart of where we are in Kansas, and in some ways the heart of where we are here in our country, which is, do we see voting as a right or a privilege? And how we get there in some ways is, I'll ask this question. You didn't know there was going to be a test. Where is the right to vote in the original Constitution? It doesn't exist. There is no original right to vote. There's nothing that specifically says there is a right, like there's a right to speech or a right to religion and so on and so forth. And because of that, we as a country have kind of defined it as we went along. In Article 4 of the Constitution, it says that it's left up to the states for the choosing and the time and the place of choosing the senators and representatives. And because of that, for 200 years, we left it up to the states. Elections is the great source of federalism. Think back to when you were in high school and so forth, federalism. It is where the federal government said, really, we're going to leave this up to the states to do. And for 200 years, we allowed that to happen. The courts didn't get involved. The federal government didn't get involved. And most people don't realize the election of 2000 wasn't the first time that we had dealt with popular vote versus electoral vote. That had happened in the 1880s. There were all kinds of reforms that occurred after that. They happened at the state level. You vote on what's called the Australian Ballot. The Australian Ballot is where I hand you a ballot, you vote it, and then I count it. In the early part of our nation's history, the way it worked was the parties handed you the ballot. Everybody came to the county seat, which is why the counties are as big as they are. You had to be able to get to the county seat to vote. Came to the county seat, and the parties handed your ballot as already filled out, and then you turned in your ballot. Well, that didn't work out the best in some ways. So there were some reforms that said, why don't we have a government official hand out the ballot, and they'll count the ballot, and we'll go from there. It isn't until the 1960s that you start to see where we talk about a right to vote. And to get there, you have to go through kind of a back way. The right to vote comes from redistricting. If you've ever lived through a redistricting battle, you're like, how does that work? It's because up until that time, there's one of my favorite quotes that kind of talk about where we lived. There was a Supreme Court case in 1940 that said it is hostile to the democratic system to involve the judiciary in the politics of the people. Think about that now, right? And so you get in the 1960s through the 14th Amendment and so forth, the right to vote. One person, one vote, Westbury versus Sanders is huge. It was interesting to me, I testified at the redistricting hearings at the last redistricting because Douglas County gets impacted by this fun little part of Kansas, which is where if you're a student or something, you get packed back to your home county. And so I was testifying about that, and a state senator from another part of Kansas said, well, the problem is one person, one vote. My district's too big, and that kind of took me aback when we talked about that. The reason we reached where we were in the 60s, it's because of the seeing elections and voting as a privilege. I have a friend of mine that runs elections in Mississippi. He carries in his back pocket his poll tax receipt that he had to pay in order to vote, to remind him of what it used to be like. That wasn't that long ago. That was in the 1950s that he paid that. If you want to test yourself, go Google the Louisiana Literacy Test. The Louisiana Literacy Test, which was given up until the 1960s, was what was given to African Americans, and they had to pass that test in order to get the right to vote. Take that test. It is a completely subjective test. Draw a circle within a circle, right? Then someone like me had the power to look at it and go, well, that's not really a circle. That's more of a square. So you don't get to pass, right? Or you had to repeat the entire Constitution. Who of us could do that? That's what it was whenever we saw voting as a privilege. You gave someone like me the ability to say, well, you didn't pass that test. Another thing to Google that I love is LBJ's speech on voting rights. Has anybody ever watched it when he went to the floor of Congress and talked about voting rights? It is one of the most powerful indictments about the right to vote, and you should all watch it. He has a quote from there that I have in my office that I love. It said, "Our fathers believed that if the noble view of the rights of man was to flourish, it must be rooted in democracy. The most basic right of all was the right to choose your own leaders. We cannot, and we must not, refuse to protect the right of every American to vote in every election that he may desire to participate. And this guides my actions." So, we get the National Voter Rights Act. We get HAVA after 2002. And a number of things where the federal government starts to tell us a little bit about elections. But the key thing for the state of Kansas is for us to know about what happens in 2008 with Crawford versus Marion County. Indiana, there were a lot of voter ID laws that had been rejected by the Supreme Court. But in 2008, there was a case that said it was okay for there to be voter ID in the state of Indiana. And the state of Indiana had a pretty strict ID law. And one of the things that they said was that it was okay for a state to provide some level of inconvenience if it meant providing some security of the ballot. But they didn't define what that was. So right after 2008, everybody took off. And they started looking at voter ID and all these different things that they could do. It's interesting when you look at when they say an inconvenience is okay. Westbury versus Sanders, which I talked about, said no right is more precious in a free country than having a voice in the election of those who make the laws under which we must live. Our Constitution leaves no room for classification which abridges this right. More importantly, when they got rid of preclearance with the Voter Rights Act, within hours, southern states had passed voter ID. Not days, not weeks, not months. As soon as that decision was passed, within hours, they had passed voter ID. In Kansas, the big one for us is in Arizona and Kansas, we now require proof of citizenship. And there was a court case that occurred that said, you know what, you can't require proof of citizenship for federal voters, but you can decide how you do it for state voters. So that's how we end up with what we call the federal form voter. So all of this is occurring, and one of the things that's a concern to me is the discussion of elections are broken. You hear this. It has become a political tactic to talk about fraud. It has become a political tactic to talk about elections are broken. We have a presidential candidate who has already said that he's not going to win because the elections are rigged. We haven't even started voting yet, all right? So it becomes now, used to be if you lost because you didn't run a good campaign. But now you go to court because you lost because the elections are rigged. When that happens, then there becomes people who just drop out of the system. When we talk about fraud and when we talk about elections being rigged, people then say, why go vote? We already struggle with voter participation in this country, and then now we have people going, well, why go vote if it's rigged, right? So that discussion of fraud sometimes frustrates me because we talk less about the positives about the election system, and we talk more about the negatives of the election system. This leads to reform. In Kansas, we've had many laws. City school elections are now going to be next year in the fall because, you know, we're going to fix turnout that way. Reform has become a big way that we have cut back on advanced voting, that we've involved voter registration and so forth. So if we're going to truly talk about reform, especially in the state of Kansas, what drives me crazy is we spend so many resources trying to keep people from voting, and we don't spend any time talking about what we're going to do to make sure people participate. And so let's talk about reform. Voter registration is the biggest barrier for someone participating, especially 18 to 24-year-olds. They missed the deadline leaving the state that they left, and they missed the deadline here, they don't get to participate. Millions didn't get to vote in the last presidential election because they missed a voter registration deadline. That's part of the fact that all the states kind of run their own show. Same-day registration is something that many states are going to, California, Indiana, Illinois, and that means that when you go to register to vote, if you've moved, you can just register to vote when you go to vote. That has cut down on provisionals, and it has changed people's participation. Another thing that we're working on in our office is education barriers. All of us, when you say that you can simply fill out a form, to many people in our county, that is a struggle. Our Secretary of State talks a lot about, it's no big deal on many of the things that we have put in place. All you need to do is fill out a form, you need to fill out an affidavit, or you need to make an appointment that calls the Lieutenant Governor, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of State, and you need to go meet in front of them. That's not intimidating at all, right? If you're a person who has limited literacy, to fill out a form is a barrier. So we should be looking at, instead of all of the forms and all the affidavits, trust me, in the past few years, the bureaucracy from limited government people is more government. I mean, I have more forms that we're filling out than I've ever done in my 12 years as a clerk. We should be figuring out what the barriers are and removing them. So in Douglas County, a few things I want you to know that you can tell people. We were the first in the country to provide a free voter ID, and it's mobile. So if you don't have any ID, I will come to your house, I will come to assisted care facility, we'll take your picture, we'll issue you an ID. And that ID is for you to vote. And we were the first in the country to do that. Because the legislation says that any government issued ID works. I'm a government, I'm issuing an ID. So if you're somebody that doesn't have an ID, we'll get them an ID. That came from, and you know where that came from? We don't think about unintended consequences. Do you know the people in our county that struggle the most with not having an ID? People who live in assisted care facilities and are usually in higher socioeconomics because they're not on state aid, they're not on federal aid, but they don't drive and they've taken a photo ID, they don't travel. And I was having people from Braden Woods and Pioneer Ridge calling going, I need to get a photo ID. And the directors were saying, I've got to transport 50 people to the DMV. So we're like, all right, we'll come take pictures. The citizenship portion of our law provides the largest inequity that I believe exists, which is when they wrote the law, they said that if you were born in Kansas, you get a free birth certificate to prove that you're a citizen. That's awesome, right? How many of us were not born in the state of Kansas? Right. Especially in this county. We all landed here at some point. I was born in New Mexico, right? You have to pay for your birth certificate. That seems a bit inequitable. So thanks to the county commissioners who helped with the funding, we will pay for the birth certificate of anyone who was born out of state and needs that birth certificate to vote. So our office will help you apply for that birth certificate and pay for it. That is what we should be doing as people who are responsible for elections, which is what is the barrier and how do I remove it? The state of Colorado, if any of you are interested in this, there's a great study that just came out. The state of Colorado a few years ago decided they were going to remove as many barriers as possible. They put in all mail ballot elections. They put in same-day registration. They put in vote centers. They improved their turnout. They reduced my favorite statistic on that one is that their provisional ballots declined from the thousands to 900 in the first year that they did that. That is what we should be doing as a state, is we should be sitting there saying, what are the things that we can be doing for our citizens? One of those is mail ballot voting. Oregon, Washington, Colorado, a couple other states have been going to mail ballot voting. That's huge for western Kansas. In many parts of western Kansas, they're down to one polling location. And if you've been to some of those counties, people will have to drive quite a ways to get to that polling location. The ability to offer mail ballots that would arrive at your house, you vote it, and it comes back to our facility actually is huge, and we would love to do it. Actually, by Kansas law, you cannot elect a person using a mail ballot. You can only do a special question. You know, voter enfranchisement has never been static in our country, and it continues to change. And so what I want you to know as your county clerk, and I'll open this up for questions, I know some of you have questions, is that I'm doing everything because at my core I do believe that it is a right. It is a fundamental right. We are a republic. And because of that republic, it means that we get to choose the people who represent us. And if we are saying some people don't have the right to represent us, then something is broken within that system. And so every day, my goal is to figure out how do I remove those barriers, and how do we make sure that everybody who wants to in this county is able to vote, has access to ballot, and their vote is counted in a secure way. So that is kind of my introduction part. Now I'll take questions.
How many provisional ballots did you have in the county?
In the primary, the number of provisional ballots we had in the primary was pretty small. I think we had about 450. Historically, a provisional ballot, and I want to touch on a provisional ballot, historically about 85% of provisional ballots are counted. It is actually a great protection. Used to be 20 years ago, if you showed up to the polling place and you weren't on the books, you were told, well, sorry. What a provisional ballot does is say, for some reason you're not on the books, you moved, you know, we didn't get your registration in, something like that. It secures your ballot. The real election doesn't happen on Tuesday night. I always like to say, who's elected on Tuesday night? No one. That's the unofficial result. The canvass, which happens, you know, a week and a half later on the local level, that's when people are elected at the local level. The state canvass is even weeks after that. That's when people are elected at the state level. So it gives us that ability to do the research and figure out they're a valid voter, they were just in the wrong place, and count that ballot. So sometimes one of the things I struggle with is rumors on the internet. And you will hear people who will say, well, provisional ballots get burned. Jamie Shew uses them for his fire pit. My favorite is you only count them if they're a close race. They are protected by federal law. So I don't want to visit Leavenworth as a prison, so I'm going to follow that federal law. But
have
so,
any of those people ever actually gone to the county canvass and watched?
Yes.
I saw 3 people there.
Yes, I always have a couple people at the canvass.
Okay,
canvass is a
I meant the angry people that say you burn them.
Yeah, canvass is a fascinating
I saw
time.
you count them.
Yeah, so we count about 85% of all provisionals. In this upcoming election, we'll have more of what I call the casual voter. They only vote every 4, 8, 12 years, so we end up with more provisionals because they've moved 4 or 5 times. So we'll end up with thousands of those. Well, thank you very much for coming out. I mean, I'm not much of a draw, but thank you.